Welcome back to our study of the Old Testament book of Joel. We're going to pick up in chapter 4 in this lesson. By way of reminder, the first three chapters, of course, have some difficult things to say to the northern kingdom of Israel. God's own people had reached the point in their own spiritual adultery through the worship of other gods and serving them. The time had come for discipline. And of course, Hosea and his family are intimately involved in all of that. In fact, his family life is being used as a visual aid to illustrate what God's trying to accomplish here. The bad news, if you will, for Israel in many ways continues on here in chapter 4. Let's pick up in verse 1. Hosea chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel. For the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land." Of course, the first phrase here in chapter 1, where it says, "Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel," that's a common phrase found in the prophets. In the start of Isaiah chapter 1, verse 10, that prophet also says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah." Of course, the illustration there is God comparing his people there to Sodom and Gomorrah, not a flattering comparison at all. Then Jeremiah as well in chapter 2, verse 4 says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Israel, and all the families of the house of Israel." So when you hear this phrase in the prophets, "Listen to the word of the Lord," it's again, in our vernacular, we might say something like, "Listen up." There's something God has to say that you need to hear. In this particular case in the book of Hosea, this call to listen to God launches the second major section of the book. That'll run from the start of chapter 4 here into chapter 9. But it reminds the hearer, reader, that the word, of course, here is from God, and that Hosea is a legitimate prophet who speaks with divine authority. So once again, Hosea isn't making this up on the fly. He's not sharing with them how he feels about the matter. No, Hosea is an intermediary. He's just sharing what God has to say to the people, and it's time for them to listen. It's made clear here, of course, that the message concerns the whole nation. The breadth of the audience is underscored by the mention of the inhabitants of the land. Again, "Listen, O word of the Lord, O sons of Israel." And then, of course, you've got the prediction of destruction when you get to chapter 4 here, verse 3, and it really includes all of creation, if you will. So no one's exempted here from this message. We see here once again as well when it says the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land. The word could be translated dispute or quarrel or contention. And this goes back to what we said in some of the introductory lessons about, if you will, it may help to picture this in your mind as a court case where God is, if you will, serving as judge, jury, and prosecutioner. But God is bringing a case against his rebellious people. We're going to see the same word later in Hosea chapter 12 and verse 2. Here, the New American Standard translates it dispute, but notice what the verse says. Hosea 12:2 says, "The Lord also has a dispute with Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds." So at that point, word is given to the northern kingdom's southern neighbor, Judah, and the time will come when God will have to bring a suit against them as well. You see the same idea in the prophet Micah in chapter 6 and verse 2. Micah chapter 6, verse 2 says, "Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord." There's the same word. We're going to see it again before the verse is done. "Listen, you mountains, to the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, because the Lord has a case against his people. Even with Israel, he will dispute." So once again, this courtroom language, if you will. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land. God is taking his people to court to answer for their crimes crimes against him, as we've seen, spiritual adultery. Israel's offenses are summarized in 3 general sins of omission in covenantal terms, followed by 6 more specific sins. We'll get to them in verse 2. So if you will, we've got sins of omission and sins of commission. And you know the difference, don't you? You can sin by not doing what God calls you to do, as well as doing something God doesn't want you to do. Here in verse 1, the case God builds against his people involved these 3 sins of omission. The first of the sins of omission, mentioned here in verse 1, is the lack of faithfulness. At the end of verse 1, God has this case against the land because there is no faithfulness, that's number 1, or kindness, number 2, or knowledge of God in the land. Let's talk here about this idea of a lack of faithfulness. It's the idea of reliability or sureness or stability or continuance. It's faithfulness in the sense of honoring a commitment made. It connotes decent, responsible relations between one person and another, or a person and God, and thus among the citizens of an entire society. We see a sense of how the word is used a couple of times in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, notice what those verses say. Nehemiah, of course, involved in the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, following the destruction earlier in their time. Nehemiah 7, 1 and 2 says, "Now when the wall was rebuilt, I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed. Then," Nehemiah says, "I put Hanani, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many." In this same family of words here, Israel was taken to task by God for their lack of faithfulness. Here, Nehemiah is highlighting how this Hananiah was a faithful man. And again, the sense is he was somebody you could rely on. He feared God more than many, and so Nehemiah was using him in a place where faithfulness was needed. Later in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 33, it says, "However, you are just in all that has come upon us." Here's part of Nehemiah's prayer of repentance and forgiveness to God. It says, "You," speaking of God, "are just in all that has come upon us, for you, God, have dealt faithfully, but we have acted wickedly." And those words of Nehemiah there just highlight what's going on back here in the book of Hosea. God had dealt faithfully, honorably, and consistently, and Israel hadn't. They had acted wickedly, just like Nehemiah's people. So that's the sin of the lack of faithfulness. Now we get to the second of the sins of omission in verse 1, and that's a lack of what the New American Standard translates as kindness. Perhaps an even better word here would be the idea of loyalty. The word in the original language suggests a bond of reciprocity that must characterize a true, ongoing personal relationship, such as the loyal grace that God's covenant generously provides to Israel. This is the same Hebrew word you see translated often in the Old Testament as the idea of loving kindness. Let's look at some other examples here in the book of Hosea, how the same word is used. Here again in chapter 4, verse 1, it's translated kindness, but the New American Standard translates it a couple other ways in the same book. Back in chapter 2 of Hosea, verse 19, you may remember that we read this. God speaking to Israel, he says, "I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness," there's the word, "and in compassion." So God wanting to have this loyal relationship with his people, but they had been unwilling. Then in chapter 6 of Hosea, verses 4 through 6, Hosea 6, 4 through 6, God pleads, he says, "What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty," and there's our word, "your loyalty is like a morning cloud." And notice how God describes their faltering loyalty. Your loyalty is like a morning cloud and like the dew which goes away early. Therefore I have hewn them in pieces by the prophets. I have slain them with the words of my mouth, and the judgments on you are like the light that goes forth. For I delight in loyalty. There's the word again. I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. God wanted his bride, Israel, to be faithful, to be loyal to him. And that's what's going on here. They had this lack of kindness, this lack of loyalty, and God was building his case upon this omission. In chapter 10, Hosea 10, verses 11 and 12. Ephraim, or Israel, is a trained heifer that loves to thrash, but I will come over her fair neck with a yoke. I will harness Ephraim, Judah will plow, Jacob will harrow for himself. Sow with a view to righteousness, reap in accordance with kindness or loyalty. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until he comes to rain righteousness on you. Again, God's people were being less than loyal, and God, through his discipline, is trying to bring that loyalty back. Finally, in Hosea chapter 12 and verse 6, near the end of the book, it says, God says through Hosea, therefore return to your God, observe kindness, observe loyalty and justice, and wait for your God continually. So once again, they had been anything but faithful, and they had been anything but loyal to God in their sin and idolatrous adultery. It's been going on. One more section of verses here that highlight this idea of loyalty or loving kindness or kindness. So back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 through 9. Moses reminds the people, he says, the Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples. For you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is, now notice this description of God and his loyalty. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness, there's the word, his loving kindness or loyalty to 1,000th generation of those who love him and keep his commandments. Now we come to the third sin of omission mentioned here in verse 1 of Hosea 4. It's characterized in my version as a lack of the knowledge of God. You've got the lack of faithfulness, the lack of loyalty or kindness, and the lack of knowledge of God. The knowledge of God, of course, is an important concept in Hosea. We've talked about it before, but it's particularly significant here, standing in parallelism with and summarizing the two sins of omission preceding it. It also points to the 6 sins of commission that are going to follow in verse 2. But notice how it's mentioned as well as we work our way through the book of Hosea, this idea of lack of knowledge, something they should have known about God. They should have had this close relationship that kept them away from their idolatry. A few verses on in Hosea 4, verse 6, we won't get to that verse today in this lesson, but notice what it's going to say. Hosea 4, 6, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. So when we get to this point in chapter 4, God is taking the priests specifically to task, the people of all people in Israel who should have had a knowledge of God and acted accordingly. But notice again the consequences for this lack of knowledge. This isn't just a sin you can say, well, I'll take it or leave it. It's not that important. No, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. There's a destruction coming, and it's based upon their fact of knowing God as they should and rejecting him. Then in chapter 6 and verse 6, we read this just a moment ago in a larger context, but I'll remind you, Hosea 6:6 says, for God says, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Sacrifice and offerings were important things in the worship of God, but yet God desires this knowledge to know him. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 5, verse 13 says this, there God said, my people go into exile for the lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. So once again, a prophet of God highlighting the consequences of this sin, this lack of doing something they should. Of course, this knowledge of God, I believe, either Old Covenant or New Covenant, is more than just an abstract knowledge of facts. It's deeper than that. It's really like what I think Jesus was trying to get at in his ministry in John chapter 17 and verse 3. Jesus says, John 17, verse 3, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you sent. Again, more than just facts about this God. No, let's know him, have an intimate relationship with him, foundational on faithfulness and loyalty. All right, let's talk about verse 2. We've just highlighted what God has listed here in his case against Israel as some things they lacked. But he's going to go on here as part of his case to talk about some things there was no lack of in their life, and unfortunately it's sinful practices. Hosea 4:2 reads this way. God says, there is swearing, deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. They, the people of Israel, employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. So in support of the accusation here that Israel had broken the covenant, God through Hosea now lists 5 sins that they were actively involved in. And I would have you, as we look at each one of these specifically, note how each one is a direct violation of one of the 10 commandments. Like in Exodus chapter 20, at the very instigation or beginning, inauguration of the nation of Israel at Sinai, of course, the 10 commandments were the foundation of that old covenant law that God gave his people. And here we're going to see that what Israel at this time in their history was involved in was a direct violation of a number of these commandments, if you will. We've talked in terms of how God was married, if you will. Israel and Judah were his bride, and he wanted them to be faithful, but they were unfaithful in these ways, unfaithful to the covenant, and God is making it very, very clear here. All right, let's look at these 5 actively involved in sins of Israel. First one he mentions there in verse 2 is swearing. This, in context here, isn't the idea of using coarse or bad language as we think of when someone is swearing. This involves the idea of making oaths that they shouldn't, taking the name of the Lord in vain. Of course, they were involved in this according to God, and that's a direct violation of the 3rd commandment, isn't it? Exodus 20 verse 7 says, God says plainly, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. The idea of invoking the name of God in an oath, in a casual or sinful way. Later in Hosea chapter 10 and verse 4, notice what is, again, part of what God is trying to bring to their attention. He says, they speak mere words, with worthless oaths they make covenants, and judgment sprouts like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. The King James here, when it says worthless, the New American Standard says worthless oaths, the King James says swearing falsely. That's what Israel is involved in. All right, that's active sin number 1. Active sin number 2 is deception. And of course, that's a violation of the 9th commandment. However, they were doing this specifically in their sinning against God and each other. And remember what God said in Exodus 20, verse 16? He says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't deceive one another. Your version may use the word lying. Again, there's a lot of different ways to deceive, but it's not right. And these people knew it clearly. Hosea 9 verses 1 and 2 says, "Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You have loved harlot's earnings on every threshing floor. Threshing floor and winepress will not feed them, and the new wine will fail them." You might say, well, I didn't hear anything about deception there. Well, right there at the end of Hosea 9:2, when it says the new wine will fail them, that's the same word translated here in Hosea 4, verse 2, is deception. The sense here is the new wine that they were putting their faith in will deceive the people. The third active sin being committed against God was murder. And that, of course, is a violation of the sixth commandment. Exodus 20, verse 13, God clearly says, "You shall not murder. Take a life unjustly." In Hosea 6, verses 8 and 9, it says, "Gilead is a city of wrongdoers, tracked with bloody footprints, and as raiders wait for a man, so a band of priests murder on the way to Shechem. Surely they have committed the crime." You catch the power of what is being said there? The priests were so involved in their sinful practices. It says a band of priests murder on the way to Shechem. Shechem being the place of worshiping God. So once again, a direct violation of the covenant of God. Number 4 is stealing. Stealing, of course, was forbidden to the old covenant people of God in the 8th commandment. Exodus 20, verse 15 says, "You shall not steal." Jeremiah brings up their stealing ways of the people of God. Jeremiah 7, verses 8 through 10. "Behold, you are trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you have not known? Then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, 'We are delivered,' that you may do all these abominations?" See, Jeremiah here in chapter 7 is listing nearly all the same sins that Hosea is bringing the people to account for in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 2. And of course, it includes stealing as well. But it's powerful what God says here through Jeremiah, isn't it? God says, "You're going to do all these things and then come and stand before me and call on my name?" How hypocritical. Finally, the 5th sin mentioned that directly violates the commandment of God is adultery, mentioned here in Hosea 4, verse 2. And God clearly said in the 7th commandment, Exodus 20, verse 14, "You shall not commit adultery." Later here in chapter 4 and verse 12, and verses 12 through 14. Go ahead a little bit and read from a chapter we'll get to eventually, later in the chapter we'll get to it. But Hosea 4, starting in verse 12, God says, "My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. They offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined." That ties us again back to verse 1, doesn't it? Where the consequences of a lack of knowledge, it leads to these kind of sins. Swearing, deception, murder, stealing, adultery, all direct violations of God's covenant with his people. Is there any doubt they were spiritually adulterous? The rest of verse, let me read Hosea 7 in connection with adultery as well. Hosea 7 verses 3 and 4 says, "With their wickedness they make the king glad, and the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker, who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened." And that's kind of an odd illustration from our vantage point in our culture, but the reference God is making there by talking about an oven heated by the baker, who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. These bakers would get up early and stoke fires in these ovens so they could bake all day. And once they got the oven good and hot, it would stay that way. And God is saying that's just the way you are in your adultery. You're red hot in these sinful practices, and you continue in them. The rest of verse 2 speaks here of, it says in my version, they employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. The idea here, of course, is the idea of just being so involved in these sinful things that one thing leads to another. Bloodshed here leads to bloodshed someone else. It's an outburst of violence. In fact, literally here, that's what the Hebrew word means. Where mine translates, they employ violence, the King James says they break out. And Bible students of the past describe it this way. It says they burst out or overflow, a metaphor taken from rivers, breaking their banks and bearing down on every obstacle by the impetuosity of their waters. The meaning is here that there is an inundation of all manner of wickedness, and all law and equity is broken through and violated. And I think that's just the idea of what's going on there. They were so sinful, they were so indulgent in their adultery against God that it's just like the dam is broken, and it's just sin after sin, bloodshed after bloodshed. All right, let's look at verse 3. This will be the final verse we'll look at this morning in chapter 4. Based upon these charges of God, the case he's making for their sins that they're committing and the things they're leaving undone, God says, therefore the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky, and also the fish of the sea disappear. So flagrant violation of the covenant of Israel, and that's exactly what we've seen here. It's exactly the charges bringing against God. Flagrant violation of the covenant of Israel by Israel will bring far-reaching consequences according to God. It's pictured here as affecting even the land and the animals. And this would be prophetic, poetic language just to highlight the depth of all of this. If this oracle was delivered during the prosperous days of Jeroboam II, and likely it was, you can imagine the reaction of the people to these words of God through Hosea, can't you? Things have been going well, they're prosperous. That's what led them into the idolatry. But you can imagine someone hearing this from Hosea, the land is going to mourn and people are going to languish. I can imagine people saying, well, that's hard to believe. It's almost impossible. I don't believe it's going to happen. Likely here, the direct reference by God would be to the devastation brought on by the invading Assyrian army. So there may be something going on here more than just a figurative description here of the far-reaching consequences. In essence, the land of Israel and the animals did, in a sense, pay a price in this by this invading army when the time comes for it. Let's look at some other verses that talk about the land mourning. In Isaiah 24, verses 3 through 5. Isaiah 24, 3 through 5. Here, Isaiah says, the earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken his word. The earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers. The exalted of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. That's exactly what's going on in Hosea. And the land, if you will, pays a price for the people's sin. Jeremiah 12, verse 4. Jeremiah says, how long is the land to mourn and the vegetation of the countryside to wither? For the wickedness, notice this, for the wickedness of those who dwell in it. Animals and birds have been snatched away, because men have said, he will not see our latter ending, or the last days. So once again, the land and the animals, who are in a sense innocent here, are paying a price along with the sinfulness of the people. One more example here is even here in the book of Hosea, in chapter 10 and verse 5. Here it says, the inhabitants of Samaria will fear for the calf of Beth-aven. Indeed, its people will mourn over it, for its idolatrous priests will cry out over it, over its glory, since it has departed from it. And I bring up this verse just to highlight the contrast with what's going on here. God says, because of the people's sin, the land and the animals will be mourning and be caught up in the punishment of God's people. What were God's people mourning over? Well, Hosea tells us in chapter 10, verse 5, that people would mourn over their destroyed idols. The only thing they were mourning over is the loss of the sins that they were able to commit with a high hand. Then finally, before we stop, let's talk about this concept of verse 3, where it says, and everyone who lives in it languishes. It's not a word you hear often, but the idea here of languishing is just kind of to fade away, to wither away. And we see it in places like, it helps explain it in Isaiah 24, verse 4. There it combines the earth mourning, and it says, the earth mourns and withers, the world fades. There's our word, languishes. The world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. And while the judgment poured out on Israel would be, in a sense, a sudden thing, the ongoing effects of the discipline for these sins would lead to a languishing that would take a long, long time to work out those consequences. So again, just covered 3 verses here. Thank you for studying along with me. The whole lot is said here. God making a case against his people, as he's done so far and will continue to do. You know, this isn't God just getting upset over a little nothing. No, God, as the prosecuting attorney, has all the evidence he needs here to convict his people of harlotry or adultery. They've not done some things they should have done, and they've done plenty of things that were direct violations of God's covenant. There's no doubt here that they're deserving of any punishment that God chooses to bring against them. And the consequences, of course, is what God goes on to talk about, and we'll continue to study that as we work our way through chapter 4. God bless. Continue in your study of the scriptures. Study ahead, starting in verse 4 of chapter 4, and Lord willing, we'll pick up next week with that verse. Have a great week.